Sometimes the most brilliant minds hide in the most unexpected places. When Dr. Vincent Ashford declared a calculus problem impossible, he never imagined that the answer would come from the woman who emptied his trash cans. This is Eleanor Hartwell's story, and it'll change everything you think you know. The grandfather clock in Whitmore Hall chimed 11 as Eleanor Hartwell pushed her cleaning cart down the marble corridors of Philadelphia's most prestigious university. At 42, Ellie had grown accustomed to being invisible. Students rushed past her without a glance. Professors stepped around her mop bucket without acknowledgement, and administrators treated her like part of the furniture. But Ellie didn't mind. In fact, she preferred it that way. Tonight, like every Tuesday night for the past 3 years, she saved Dr. Vincent Ashford's advanced calculus classroom for last. Not because it was the messiest, quite the opposite. Dr. Ashford ran his classroom with military precision. Every chalk mark had purpose. Every equation served a greater mathematical truth. Ellie had discovered something about herself in this room, something she'd kept buried for 20 years. As she quietly entered the classroom, she noticed the blackboard still covered with today's lesson. Complex differential equations sprawled across the surface like beautiful, intricate puzzles. Her heart quickened, the way it always did when she saw mathematics in its purest form. She set down her supplies and approached the board, her eyes tracing each symbol, each variable, each elegant solution. Without thinking, her finger began following the chalk marks, working through the problems in her mind. "Fascinating," she whispered to herself, spotting an error in the third equation. He missed the chain rule application there. Ellie had always been good with numbers. As a child growing up in South Philadelphia, she'd been the one neighbors called when their checkbooks wouldn't balance. In high school, she'd tutored classmates in calculus while working part-time at her family's diner. She'd even earned a full scholarship to this very university. But life, as it often does, had other plans. 3 weeks before starting her mathematics degree, her father suffered a massive heart attack. The diner, their family's only source of income, needed someone to run it. Her younger brother was only 15. Her mother was overwhelmed with grief and medical bills. Ellie made the choice that responsible daughters make. She deferred her scholarship, rolled up her sleeves, and saved her family's business. That deferment became permanent when she met Theodore Hartwell, a kind-hearted construction worker who frequented the diner. They fell in love over coffee and her homemade apple pie. Marriage came quickly, then Ted's accident on a construction site, then years of medical bills and caregiving, and finally his death from complications 3 years ago. Now at 42, Ellie found herself starting over with nothing but a high school diploma and a job that paid enough to cover her small apartment and Ted's remaining medical debt. But in this classroom, surrounded by the mathematical concepts that had once filled her dreams, she felt like herself again. She pulled out her phone and discreetly photographed the more complex problems, telling herself it was just curiosity. Later, in her tiny apartment, she'd work through them, finding elegant solutions that would never see the light of day. Tonight felt different, though. Tomorrow was Wednesday, which meant Dr. Ashford's most challenging class of the week. She had overheard him telling a colleague that he planned to present an impossible problem to humble his overconfident students. "These kids think they know everything," Dr. Ashford had said with his characteristic arrogance. "Time to show them how much they don't know." Ellie had bristled at his tone. She'd seen these students, bright, eager minds hungry for knowledge. They deserved encouragement, not humiliation. As she began cleaning the erasers, mathematical formulas danced through her mind. She wondered what problem Dr. Ashford considered impossible. In her experience, very few mathematical problems were truly impossible, just misunderstood or approached from the wrong angle. Wednesday afternoon arrived with Philadelphia's typical autumn chill. Dr. Vincent Ashford strode into his advanced calculus classroom, wearing his usual expression of intellectual superiority. At 54, he'd built his reputation on 2 things: brilliant mathematical insights and an ego to match. 23 students filled the tiered seats, notebooks open, pencils ready. Among them sat Bethany Morrison, a bright engineering major from Ohio, and Marcus Whitfield, a pre-med student who'd been struggling with advanced mathematics all semester. "Good afternoon, class," Dr. Ashford announced, his voice carrying the weight of academic authority. "Today, We're going to explore the boundaries of your mathematical understanding." He turned to the blackboard and began writing a complex differential equation. The chalk clicked rhythmically against the slate as variables and integrals emerged in precise formation. "This," he said, stepping back to admire his work, "is what I call the Ashford challenge. It's a differential equation that has stumped graduate students and postdoctoral researchers alike." Bethany leaned forward in her seat, studying the equation intently. Something about the structure seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Marcus, meanwhile, felt his stomach drop. He'd barely grasped last week's material, and now this intimidating professor was presenting something he called impossible. "I've given this problem to every advanced class for the past 5 years," Dr. Ashford continued, his tone growing more condescending with each word. "Not a single student has solved it, not one. It requires a level of mathematical sophistication that, frankly, most of you haven't developed yet." A student in the back row raised her hand tentatively. "Professor Ashford, if it's impossible, why are you showing it to us?" Dr. Ashford's smile was cold. "Because understanding your limitations is as important as understanding mathematics itself. Sometimes recognizing what you cannot do is the first step toward intellectual humility." The classroom fell silent. Students exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't education. It was humiliation disguised as pedagogy. Outside in the hallway, Ellie was finishing her afternoon rounds. She'd switched shifts with a colleague, telling herself she needed the extra hours. In truth, she couldn't resist the opportunity to see Dr. Ashford's impossible problem. She positioned her cart near the slightly open classroom door, pretending to organize her supplies while listening to the lesson. "I'll give you 30 minutes, Dr. Ashford announced. "Work individually or in groups, it won't matter. This equation has no solution within the scope of undergraduate mathematics." Ellie's breath caught as she glimpsed the equation through the doorway. Her mind immediately began processing the variables, recognizing patterns, identifying potential approaches. It wasn't impossible at all. In fact, Ellie could see 3 different solution paths from where she stood. The professor had simply approached it from the wrong angle, creating unnecessary complexity where elegance could prevail. Inside the classroom, students bent over their papers with varying degrees of hope and frustration. Bethany worked furiously, sensing she was close to something significant. Marcus had given up after 10 minutes, convinced this was beyond his abilities. "Time's up," Dr. Ashford called, though only 20 minutes had passed. As expected, silence. This equation represents the kind of mathematical thinking that separates amateur students from true mathematicians. He began erasing the board with deliberate strokes, each swipe emphasizing his point about their inadequacy. "Sir," Bethany called out, her voice stronger than she felt, "could you leave it up for a few more minutes? I think I was getting somewhere." Dr. Ashford paused, chalk eraser in hand. "Miss Morrison, I appreciate your optimism, but wishful thinking isn't mathematics. If graduate students can't solve this, what makes you think—" "Because maybe fresh eyes see things differently," she interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. The professor's expression darkened. "Miss Morrison, this isn't a matter of perspective. This is advanced differential calculus, not a creative writing exercise." In the hallway, Ellie felt her hands clench into fists. She'd watched this man crush student spirits week after week, hiding his own pedagogical failures behind impossible challenges. Her mind raced through the solution again. The equation was actually quite beautiful once you approached it correctly. It reminded her of problems she'd solved in high school before life forced her down a different path. 20 years of suppressed mathematical passion suddenly surged through her veins like wildfire. The classroom door creaked softly as Ellie stepped inside, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. 23 pairs of student eyes turned toward her, followed by Dr. Ashford's look of annoyed confusion. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "This is a closed classroom session. If you need to clean, come back after—" "The equation," Ellie interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've made it more complicated than it needs to be." Dr. Ashford's face reddened. "I beg your pardon? This is a university classroom, not a maintenance closet. You need to leave immediately." But Ellie was already walking toward the blackboard, drawn by mathematical certainty stronger than social convention. Her years of invisibility had prepared her for this moment. She had nothing left to lose. "May I?" she asked, reaching for a piece of chalk. Absolutely not. Dr. Ashford stepped between Ellie and the board. This is highly inappropriate. I'm calling security. Bethany Morrison stood up suddenly. Wait, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Let her try. What could it hurt? Marcus nodded in agreement. Yeah, Professor. If it's really impossible, what's the worst that could happen? Dr. Ashford looked around the classroom, seeing expectant faces for the first time in years. His reputation was built on maintaining absolute authority, but refusing this woman's attempt would look petty, even by his standards. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. But when you fail, I want you to understand that mathematics isn't a guessing game. It requires years of rigorous training. Ellie took the chalk with trembling fingers. 20 years of dreams condensed into this single moment. Ellie approached the equation the way she'd approached every mathematical problem since childhood, with patience, intuition, and respect for the beauty hidden within complexity. The issue, she began, her voice growing stronger, is that you're treating this as a standard differential equation when it's actually a system of coupled equations in disguise. She began writing beneath the original problem, her handwriting confident and clear. If we substitute U for this entire expression here, and V for this one, we can separate the variables? Dr. Ashford watched in stunned silence as Ellie rewrote the equation with elegant simplicity. Her approach was unconventional, but mathematically sound. Now, Ellie continued, warming to her subject, we apply integration by parts, but instead of the traditional approach, we use this substitution to eliminate the transcendental terms. The chalk moved across the board with practiced precision. Each step flowed naturally from the previous one, creating a solution path that was both innovative and rigorously correct. Students leaned forward in their seats. Even those who struggled with basic calculus could follow Ellie's clear, logical progression. She explained each step without condescension, treating mathematics as a conversation rather than a lecture. The key insight, Ellie said, stepping back to reveal her work, is recognizing that this equation describes a physical system with harmonic oscillation properties. Once you see that pattern, the solution becomes, well, not impossible at all. She set down the chalk and turned to face the classroom. The silence was deafening. Dr. Ashford stared at the blackboard, his face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and something that might have been embarrassment. The solution was correct. Not only correct, but elegant in its simplicity. Bethany Morrison was the first to speak. That's brilliant. I was trying to force it through standard methods, but your substitution approach... She trailed off, studying the board with obvious admiration. How did you know to make that initial substitution? Marcus asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. Ellie felt a blush creep up her neck. For 20 years, she'd been invisible. Now, suddenly, she was the center of attention in a university classroom, explaining advanced mathematics to students half her age. Pattern recognition, she said simply. Mathematics is full of patterns. Sometimes you have to step back and look at the bigger picture instead of getting lost in the details. Dr. Ashford finally found his voice. Where did you learn to approach differential equations this way? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ellie looked around the classroom, seeing young faces filled with curiosity and respect. For the first time in years, she felt like the person she was always meant to be. I learned, she said quietly, by loving mathematics more than I feared looking foolish. The classroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Dr. Ashford stared at the blackboard as if the mathematical symbols might rearrange themselves into something that made sense within his carefully constructed worldview. This is impossible, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. You work in maintenance. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Ellie felt the familiar sting of social judgment, but this time, something was different. The mathematical proof on the board spoke louder than any degree or title ever could. I am a maintenance worker, she said with quiet dignity. But that doesn't make the mathematics any less correct. Bethany Morrison stood up, her notebook clutched to her chest. Ma'am, that substitution method you used, I've never seen anything like it. Where did you study? The question hit Ellie like a physical blow. Where had she studied? In stolen moments between serving coffee and balancing checkbooks. In the quiet hours after Ted's doctor's appointments. In the darkness of her small apartment, working through problems by lamplight while her husband slept. "I never finished college," she said simply. "Life got in the way." Dr. Ashford seized on this admission like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. "Exactly. This confirms what I've been saying. Mathematical intuition without formal training leads to lucky guesses, not genuine understanding." He approached the board with renewed confidence, determined to find flaws in Ellie's solution. But as he traced through each step, his expression grew increasingly troubled. The work was flawless, more than flawless. It was innovative. Ellie had identified a solution path that he himself had never considered, using techniques that demonstrated deep understanding of mathematical relationships. "Professor Ashford," Marcus called out, "is her solution correct?" The question forced Dr. Ashford to confront an uncomfortable truth. His reputation had been built on presenting impossible problems, maintaining intellectual distance from his students. But this woman, this maintenance worker, had solved his unsolvable equation in under 10 minutes. "The methodology is unconventional," he said carefully, "but the mathematical reasoning appears sound." "Appears sound?" Bethany challenged. "Either it's correct or it isn't. Mathematics doesn't care about appearances." Dr. Ashford's face reddened. Being challenged by a student was bad enough, but being challenged while a maintenance worker's solution stared at him from his own blackboard was intolerable. "Miss Morrison, I'll remind you that I have a PhD in mathematics from Harvard University. I think I'm qualified to evaluate mathematical solutions." "Then evaluate it," Ellie said quietly. All eyes turned back to her. She stood beside the blackboard like an unlikely warrior, armed only with chalk dust and 20 years of suppressed brilliance. "Don't question it because of who solved it," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Question it because of whether it's right. Mathematics doesn't care about my job title any more than it cares about your PhD. Truth is truth." The classroom erupted in whispered conversations. Students who had spent months being intimidated by Dr. Ashford's intellectual bullying suddenly saw him through different eyes. Dr. Ashford walked to his desk and pulled out a calculator, working through Ellie's solution step by step. Each calculation confirmed what he already knew but couldn't bring himself to admit. She was right, completely, elegantly, brilliantly right. "How?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. "How does someone without formal training develop this level of mathematical sophistication?" Ellie thought of her father, teaching her to balance books before she could reach the diner's cash register, of high school nights spent tutoring classmates because she loved seeing understanding dawn in their eyes, of Ted, encouraging her to work through complex problems even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them both. "Because mathematics isn't about degrees or titles," she said. "It's about curiosity. It's about asking questions and not being satisfied with impossible as an answer." She walked to the board and erased a small section of her work, then rewrote it with slight modification. "Actually, there's an even more elegant approach if you're willing to think outside traditional methods." The new solution was shorter, more intuitive, and absolutely beautiful in its simplicity. Dr. Ashford sat down heavily in his chair. In 10 minutes, this woman had not only solved his impossible equation, but had improved upon her own solution. She had demonstrated the kind of mathematical thinking he'd spent his career claiming to possess. More importantly, she had shown his students what real mathematical passion looked like. The silence stretched until Bethany Morrison began to clap, slowly, tentatively at first. Then, with growing enthusiasm, Marcus joined her, then another student, until the entire classroom erupted in applause. Ellie stood frozen beside the blackboard, overwhelmed by recognition she'd never expected and never sought. For 20 years, her mathematical abilities had been a private refuge. Now, suddenly, they were public knowledge. "Ma'am," called a student from the back row, "what's your name?" "Eleanor Hartwell," she said, her voice catching slightly. "But everyone calls me Ellie." Dr. Ashford remained seated, staring at the elegant solution that had shattered his carefully constructed academic superiority. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual arrogance. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology. And perhaps more importantly, I owe my students an apology." He stood and walked to the front of the classroom, positioning himself beside Ellie rather than in front of her. For 5 years, I've used this equation to prove a point about intellectual limitations. I told myself I was teaching humility, but I was really teaching hopelessness. You've shown me, shown all of us, that the only real limitation is our willingness to think differently. Bethany raised her hand. Professor, if Mrs. Hartwell could solve this, maybe the problem wasn't that it was impossible. Maybe the problem was how you were teaching us to approach it. The observation hit Dr. Ashford like a physical blow. How many bright minds had he discouraged? How many students had left his classroom believing they weren't smart enough for mathematics? You're absolutely right, Miss Morrison, he admitted. I've been so focused on proving my own intelligence that I forgot my job is to nurture yours. Ellie watched this exchange with mixed emotions. Part of her felt vindicated, years of invisible brilliance finally acknowledged, but another part of her felt sadness for all the dreams deferred, all the potential unrealized. Mrs. Hartwell, Dr. Ashford continued, would you mind if I asked about your background? This level of mathematical insight doesn't develop in a vacuum. Ellie took a deep breath. I was supposed to start here 24 years ago, full scholarship for mathematics. But my father got sick, and my family needed me to run our diner. She gestured around the classroom. I used to clean this room at night and work through the problems you'd leave on the board. It was the closest I could get to the life I'd planned. Marcus leaned forward. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you try to audit classes or talk to professors? The question revealed the gulf between their worlds. Marcus couldn't imagine a reality where someone with Ellie's abilities would remain invisible by choice. Because, Ellie said gently, when you're wearing a janitor's uniform, people don't usually ask about your thoughts on differential calculus. And honestly, I wasn't sure I had anything valuable to contribute anymore. Dr. Ashford felt shame wash over him. How many times had Ellie cleaned his classroom while he worked late, never acknowledging her presence? How many opportunities for collaboration had he missed because of his own prejudices? Mrs. Hartwell, he said formally, I'd like to make you an offer. Would you consider guest lecturing for my classes? Not as a curiosity, but as a genuine mathematical collaborator. Ellie's eyes widened. I don't have credentials. I can't teach university students. You just did, Bethany pointed out. You explained that solution better than most of our professors explain basic concepts. She's right, Marcus added. You made it actually make sense instead of just showing off how smart you are. Dr. Ashford winced at the accurate characterization of his teaching style. Mrs. Hartwell, credentials matter less than understanding, and you clearly understand mathematics in ways that could benefit our students. Ellie looked around the classroom, seeing young faces filled with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. For the first time in decades, she felt like her mathematical abilities had real value beyond personal satisfaction. I'd need to keep my regular job, she said practically. I have bills to pay. Of course, Dr. Ashford nodded. This would be supplemental. Perhaps one evening lecture per month, working through complex problems using your innovative approaches. And maybe, Bethany suggested excitedly, you could help with study groups. A lot of us struggle with the standard textbook explanations. The offer hung in the air like a bridge between two versions of Ellie's life, the one she'd lived and the one she'd dreamed of. At 42, she was being offered a chance to return to mathematics not as a student, but as a teacher. I need to think about it, she said honestly. This is all very sudden. Dr. Ashford nodded. Take all the time you need. My office door is always open. As students began packing their notebooks, Bethany approached Ellie. Mrs. Hartwell, what you did today, you changed something for all of us. You showed us that mathematics isn't about proving you're smarter than everyone else. It's about solving problems and helping people understand. Ellie felt tears prick her eyes. That's what mathematics always was for me. A way to make sense of things, to find beauty in complexity. Will you really consider teaching? Marcus asked hopefully. Ellie looked at the blackboard, still covered with her elegant solution. 20 years ago, she'd walked away from this world to take care of her family. Today, perhaps, the world had found its way back to her. Yes, she said softly. I think I will. As students filed out of the classroom, chattering excitedly about the day's unexpected lesson, Ellie remained beside the blackboard. Dr. Ashford approached her quietly. Mrs. Hartwell, I have one more question. Why today? What made you finally speak up? Ellie considered the question seriously. Because, she said finally, I realized that hiding your gifts doesn't protect anyone. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is walk to the board and show people what's possible. Dr. Ashford nodded slowly. You know, I've been teaching for 15 years. I thought I understood what education meant, but today, you taught me something I'd forgotten. What's that? That the best teachers aren't the ones who prove how much they know. They're the ones who show others how much they can discover. Ellie smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. Maybe that's what mathematics is really about. Not the answers we already know, but the questions we're brave enough to ask. As she gathered her cleaning supplies and prepared to return to her regular duties, Ellie took one last look at the equation on the board. Tomorrow, she would still be a maintenance worker, but she would also be something more. She would be Eleanor Hartwell, mathematician. Eleanor Hartwell's story reminds us that brilliance doesn't always wear academic robes or carry prestigious degrees. Sometimes it comes in work clothes, carrying wisdom earned through life's hardest lessons. How many Eleanor Hartwells do we pass by every day? How many brilliant minds remain hidden because we've decided intelligence only looks one way? Dr. Ashford learned that true education isn't about proving superiority. It's about nurturing curiosity wherever it blooms. Ellie became one of the university's most beloved guest lecturers, inspiring students with her innovative thinking and genuine passion. What dreams are you hiding? What gifts have you convinced yourself don't matter? Remember, it's never too late to walk to the board and show the world what you're capable of. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to remember their potential has no expiration date. Comment below. Where are you watching from? And what dream are you ready to pursue? Until next time, keep believing in extraordinary, ordinary people.